Abend alle, good evening. With gratitude and hope, I welcome each of you to this gathering. It's quite serendipitous, I think, that we are able to gather on January 21, 2025, the exact day of the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the movement. And it just so happened that Astrid von Schlachta is here in Manitoba, and so we accept this as a gift from God. This evening, we commemorate 500 years since the birth of the Anabaptist movement. Today, we remember the faith and courage of those who came before us, men and women who sought, at great personal cost, to live faithfully according to Scripture. Let's begin by recalling the decisive event described in Hutterite Chronicle. This is the account. Und es hat sich begeben, dass sie seien beieinander gewesen, bis die Angst anging und auf sie kam, ja in ihren Herzen gedrungen wurden. Da haben sie angefangen, ihre Knie zu biegen vor dem höchsten Gott im Himmel und ihn angerufen als ein Herzenskundigen und gebeten, dass ihnen Wort geben, zu tun seinen göttlichen Willen und dass ihre Barmherzigkeit wollen beweisen. Denn Fleisch und Blut oder menschlicher Fürwitz hat sie gar nicht getrieben, weil sie wohl gewiss, dass sie darüber werden bluten und leiden müssen. Nach dem Gebet ist der Georg vom Haus Jakob aufgestanden und hat um Gottes Willen gebeten, den Konrad Grebel, dass er nun taufen mit dem rechten christlichen Tauf auf seinen Glauben und Erkanntnis. Und da er niedergekniet mit solchem Bitt und Begehren, hat der Konrad ihn getauft, weil dazu war sonst kein verordneter Diener solches Werk zu handeln war. Wie nun das geschehen, haben die anderen gleicherweise an den Georgen begehrt, dass er sie taufen soll, welches er auf ihr Begehren auch also tät. Und haben sich also in hoher Furcht Gottes miteinander an den Namen des Herrn ergeben, einer den anderen zum Dienst des Evangeliums bestätigt und angefangen, den Glauben zu lehren und halten. Damit ist die Absünderung von der Welt und von ihren bösen Werken angebrochen. It's worth noting that this account from our chronicle is the most significant primary source for this event. And today, throughout the Anabaptist world, our friends in the faith are reflecting on these very same words. As historians, we rely on the account from the Chronicle, the Hutterite Chronicle, to learn about this event. Today is a time of reflection, not only on the past, but also on the present and future. How can we draw from this wellspring of faith to navigate our challenges and opportunities, to remain faithful in a world that often tempts us to compromise? To provide fodder for our historical reflections, we are fortunate to have Dr. Astrid von Schlachta with us this evening. She's one of the leading European scholars on Hutterite history at the moment, with numerous books to remain. She, for example, has an essay on Hutter in the recent volume that I published. She comes to us from Weierhof, Germany, where she leads the Mennonitische Forschungsstelle, the Mennonite Research Center, and is a lecturer at the University of Regensburg. She's published widely on history of Anabaptism, pietism, and the estates in the early modern period. So much we could discuss with her. She's a member of the Mennonite congregation in Regensburg and on the board of the Associated Mennonite Churches in Germany. Astrid, we're so glad to have you here this evening. Before welcoming her to the stage, let us pray. Himmlischer Vater, wir danken dir für die Gnade, die du unseren Vorfahren geschenkt hast, in Treue und Mut deinen Willen zu suchen und zu leben. Hilf uns, ihr Beispiel zu ehren und ihr Erbe in unserem eigenen Leben weiterzuführen. Leite uns mit deinem Geist, damit wir in Einheit, Demut und Liebe deinen Namen verherrlichen und das Evangelium in dieser Welt verkünden. Segne dieses Gedenken und erfülle uns mit Weisheit und Kraft für die Zukunft. In Jesu Namen beten. Amen. Astrid, bitte.
So, you can hear me. It's fine. Yeah, I'm glad to be here at this day. I mean, it's special to be among the Hutterites at this special day. It's really exactly this day, 500 years ago. And this day is actually the thing, or the day why we have the whole commemoration of the 500 years of Anabaptism. And it's especially fun to be here in Baker because we I just heard, and I didn't remember that we had a seminar here in 1997, so when the school started. So, okay, I will, I'll take you back today into Hutterite history. And we are reflecting a little bit about what it means. What does history mean to us today? And what's just the 500 years, and especially three main topics of the 500 years made for the Hutterites. And I will start with not such a long quotation as Kenny has just read for us from the Chronicle, but a quotation from the Martyrs Mirror. It is dark times in which we live. Indeed, they are more dangerous now than in the days of our fathers who suffered death for the testimony of the Lord. Only a few people will understand this, because most people only see the outward and visible, in which it is now better, calmer, and more easygoing. But these times are more dangerous. Oh, okay. So you can go on reading while we change the batteries. Okay, but these times are more dangerous, for in former times Satan came publicly to our way. Can you hear when I talk?
Yeah, okay. It's okay.
For in former times Satan came publicly to his servants, even in broad daylight, as a fierce lion, so that one could recognize him and hide from him in good time. His intention was mainly to destroy the body, but now he comes, as it were, in the night or in the twilight, in an unrecognizable and yet pleasant form. He lurks in two ways to destroy the soul. On the one hand, to demolish the Christian faith, which alone saves, and on the other hand, to demolish, if it were possible, the true Christian life in separation from which faith springs. So that's some words from the foreword of the Martyrs Mirror. The picture that the author conveys here is as follows. The world is beautiful and nice and calm now. It has never been like this before for Anabaptists. Now, no persecution, no executions, no expulsions. Instead, toleration of the Anabaptists. They live in a tolerant environment. But that is precisely what makes life so dangerous, namely the spiritual life. Because instead of dying a physical death, as before, martyrdom, because of the Anabaptist faith, believers would now die a spiritual death. Peaceful times do not always produce good Christians, good Anabaptists. Peaceful times do not always produce good Christians, good Anabaptists. Maybe when we experience peaceful times and no persecutions, maybe exactly in these moments, we might even more reflect about our faith and ask ourselves one more time, where am I in my spiritual and in my communal life? The passage is read from the title, from the forward of the Martyrs Mirror. You have here the title page of the Martyrs Mirror. And maybe the Martyrs Mirror is at least in your school, or maybe in some of your homes. Maybe you know the Martyrs Mirror. It is a thick book that collects a lot of stories of the martyrs of the early Anabaptists, including the Hutterites. So there are also martyr stories of the Hutterites in the Martyrs Mirror. The Martyrs Mirror was first published in 1660, so in the middle of the 17th century, more than 100 years after the Anabaptists began. And it was published by Dutch Mennonites. Here is the cover of the second German edition from 1780. And it had a reason why Dutch Mennonites published the book exactly in the middle of the 17th century. The text we just read tells us something about the reason why it was necessary to publish the Martyrs Mirror. Because the times are too good and too peaceful. That's why we have to show our people, so the Mennonites of the middle of the 17th century, how hard the life of the believers was about 100 years ago. How cruelly Anabaptists died for their faith, and how faithful our forefathers were to their beliefs. The Martyrs Mirror, when it was published, was intended to strengthen the memory of earlier times. A commemoration to help the Mennonites of the 17th century regain a firmer and more serious and faithful life as believers. That was the reason why the Martyrs Mirror was published, as we read in the foreword. Remembrance is a mirror and a challenge for future generations. So what function does remembrance have? This year, as we now said, we are looking back on 500 years of Anabaptism and commemorate the first Anabaptist baptism of faith exactly 500 years ago. And the Hutterites are invited to join the commemoration, and they are commemorating this evening. But we can ask, when does the Hutterite Church have 500 years? When can you look back on 500 years? When maybe 2028? When it was 500 years ago, 1528, that the group around Jakob Wiedemann introduced community of goods in the area of Nikolsburg. Or maybe in 2029, when Jacob Hutter first came to Moravia, or 2033, when Jakob Hutter was elected elder of the community in 1533. So, I don't know, maybe you can start discussing when you want to commemorate 500 years of Anabaptist, of Hutterite history. When did the Hutterite Church start? When did it start? And what should we remember from the rich treasure of the 500 years of history? And 500 years, that's a long time, with a lot of chapters, a lot of changes, a lot of stories, events, a lot of changes. Because what once started as a movement in 1525, with a lot of life, very spontaneous. The first generations were very enthusiastic. They had a lot of energy, a lot of spirit, and outgoing power. Think of the lively mission work the Hutterites did in the 16th century. But it didn't remain the way it was. The historian Robert Friedman, who did a lot of research on the Hutterites, once wrote that interesting quote here. The first generation had witnessed a spontaneous biblical spiritualism and enthusiasm, which was in little need of external organization and formulation. The third or fourth generation of Anabaptism, on the other hand, if it can still be called Anabaptism, showed a definite trend toward the denominational type of church life where everything becomes more or less standardized and organized in a final form which allows only minor changes later. So that's what Robert Friedman said only long ago. Life of a community is changing. The identity of a community is changing. That's normal, not unusual. The question just is, how do we deal with changes? How do we reflect on changes? For community, be it the Hutterites, but also the Mennonites, who are not such a close community as the Hutterites are, it is very important to think about changes again and again, and reflect, and have a look into the past. This is always good when you are confronted with changes, or with times where you have the feeling, well, that's really a time of transmission. Then it is always good to have a look into the past. But not only look into the past because you see a good past and you enjoy the past, but when you look into the past, always keep the present and the future in mind. Or to turn it otherwise, let our look or in a view back into the past be guided by the wish to shape the present and try to think for the future. Remembrance is a very important aspect of social coexistence. It is very important for communities, especially for spiritual communities, such as the Mennonites and the Hutterites, to have a form of remembrance. We remember a shared history as Hutterites, as Mennonites, and we even have a shared history as Anabaptists, because we all go back to that movement. This shared history is very important for the affiliation of later generations. But, as Robert Friedman said, when everything starts to become rigid in the third and fourth generation, when it becomes standardized and organized, then it is important to remember the lives of the forefathers of the first generation, where the fire was still burning. Are we still on fire today, on fire for our faith? Or ask we ourselves the question, why are we no longer on fire for our faith? Though I want to make a very important remark, we should never idealize the life of the first generations. But it must be remembered in order to place one's own life in the context of history. And in order to be challenged in our own life. That we challenge ourselves by looking back into history. And to ask the important questions where we currently stand. Where do I stand spiritually today? Where do I stand in my community today? And where does my community stand today? Looking back into history is therefore a challenge and an inquiry into the lives of later generations. Let's take a look at the second important history book of the Anabaptists. Kenny already quoted it, that's the Hutterite Chronicle. Let's see what Caspar Breitmichel wrote in the preface of the Chronicle. Caspar Breitmichel started to write the Chronicle. And he wrote down all the events up to the year 1542. And he notes in the preface the following. I am convinced that this book will be a beautiful mirror for many faithful believers to see themselves in. To beware of all divisions, errors, and what does not serve the honor of God. It is also my request that everyone who reads this book should read it with sincere attention in the fear of God, not to be offended, but for the improvement and edification of yourself and your next. We see Caspar Breitmichel was not only interested in recording the events in the Chronicle, just telling what happened, but he also had programmed an attention by writing the Chronicle. The Chronicle should be a beautiful mirror. Here, a beautiful mirror for many faithful believers to see themselves in. With the aim of ensuring that future generations avoid the mistakes of their ancestors, not do all the garbage, all the trash again that the forefathers did, to learn from history. Improvement and edification, as Friedrich writes. When we in Germany started in 2018 to think about 2025, it was long ago, 7 years, and it's always astonishing how fast time flies. Now we have 2025. But when we started to think about 2025, we formed an association to prepare the Anabaptist commemoration, and you see here our logo for the 500 Jahre Täuferbewegung, gewahrt, 500 Jahre Täuferbewegung. And we were thinking about 6 characteristics of the Anabaptists, of which we were convinced that they would have something to say to the people today, in the 21st century. So thinking, well, we have that history, and what can we take out of that history that will be important for the 21st century? And these characteristics became 6 annual themes, so we had 6 years, and each year dealt with a characteristic of the Anabaptists. These were the characteristics we chose. Daring, gewagt, living responsible or maturely, daring, living together, daring, living consistently, daring, living non-violently, daring, living hope, and daring, living the Bible. That's the theme for this year. These topics should invite to reflect what it means to live as an Anabaptist today. And I would like to highlight now three key characteristics of these 6, and this is mature, that I have chosen for the title, and I'll tell you in a minute that what mature means. It's not to be 18 and then be legally mature, but it's really connected to responsibility and accountability. So, mature, communal, and peaceful. 3 terms that also characterize the early phase of Hutterites. And that's why we first now want to have a short look into the situation of the first generation Hutterites. You know this beautiful painting because you all know the book Kenny just published, the Hutterite Source Reader, that's on the title of that book. So the Hutterites in Tyrol. In those days when many Hutterites still lived in Tyrol, life was extremely dangerous for them. The persecution was intense. The Habsburg sovereigns issued many mandates demanding the expulsion or execution of the Anabaptists. And these mandates also defined that anyone who gives the Anabaptists shelter or helps the Anabaptists in any way must expect punishment. One can imagine how hard life must have been. But this is only the one side of the picture, only one side of the coin. The harsh persecution, and the merciless demands of the political authorities. There was also another side of the picture, and that looked like follows. The authorities were not at all satisfied with how the persecution of the Anabaptists was really going. Because to trace the Anabaptists did not work nearly as well as the authorities had hoped. The authorities, so the local authorities, the magistrates and the judges, were far too careless. Both the local authorities and the people in the villages repeatedly protected the Anabaptists. It is said the common man leans toward the Anabaptists, and we have research on certain regions in Tyrol where we can really say that the Anabaptist movement was a mass movement. For example, in the Puster Valley, that's where Jakob Hutter was born. So the sources tell us that the Anabaptists were publicly tolerated by the people in the villages. No one would report the Anabaptists to the authorities. The Anabaptists would even be warned when the authorities came to get hold of the believers gathered in the meetings. In the Puster Valley, the Anabaptists could even preach in public, it is said in the sources. And finally, the authorities complained, Anabaptists who were already in prison were simply released again. The sources also report that imprisoned Anabaptists got help. This is how paper, ink, and pens found their way into the prisons again and again, which was a good thing, because when the prisoners would not have been able to write in the prison, then we would miss a lot of wonderful letters that found their way from the prisons to the congregation in Moravia. Let's take a look at the lives of the Anabaptists themselves. We have already heard life was dangerous, despite all the help from the people. Anabaptist meetings could only take place in secret. The meetings often lasted several days. People came together for several days to have fellowship, and often the secret meetings, the secret gatherings took place like here in the wood or somewhere very far from the villages. People came together for several days to have fellowship, to listen to the sermons, to celebrate communion, and to be baptized. The sources report it was 3 days or even 8 days. So they stayed together 8 days to have fellowship. And that also means that supplies had to be provided. It is said in the sources that the strongest brothers would be sent ahead to organize the meetings. Food had to be brought. And all the supplies had to be brought to the meeting. The life of the Anabaptists in Tyrol was in general very informal and with a very few institutional structures. The individual believer participated very extensively. There was always a gathering, somebody read from the Bible, somebody preached, and often, or maybe all the times after the sermon, the preacher asked the people whether they believed what the message preached was, and if they affirmed this and wanted to be baptized, then they were baptized. That was often quite spontaneous. And the Anabaptists used what was available. So you have here a picture of an Anabaptist baptism. That's not Hutterite, that's in Münster actually. But what you see is typical Anabaptist in the early times. They took what was there, here a bucket of water and a ladle to baptize. So just took out the water, poured it on the believer, and that was it. At that time, baptism was also not yet seen as baptism into the church, but as a sign for a covenant between the believer and God. By the way, we also have reports from the early Anabaptist period that women preached. For example, in Tyrol, we learn of the Faustfleischhackerin, or the Gallin, or the Kreuzerin. These are all names for women. And we know that they preached in the early times. Another source reports that the wives of the Vorsteher read as well as the Vorsteher. And that meant that they read from the Bible as well as the Vorsteher. And maybe we have even very few women that baptized in the early times. That's not quite qualified, but there are some hints. Now let's have a closer look at the spiritual life itself. Maturity. That's a term we use for the title. Maturity, that's a term that in our context, here for the Anabaptist movement, does not mean to be 18 years old and to be legally mature, but it means spiritually mature. A status in which God has put us as Christians. We as Christians are mature in our relation to God. That means God has empowered us as Christians to stand before Him maturely. We don't need a medium or an intermediary to get into contact with God. And God has empowered us to act as mature Christians in the world, in our community, and in our private relations. Responsible and in accountability. Being a Christian in an Anabaptist context. For the early Anabaptists, maturity meant involving everybody in the spiritual conversation. We have a very interesting account from Swiss Anabaptists from the 1540s. In that writing, Swiss Anabaptists had to answer for why they did not go to church, and that meant they did not go to the Reformed Church. They refused to go there. And as justification, the Anabaptists referred to 1 Corinthians 14. They argue 1 Corinthians 14 would state that everyone is invited to speak at the gatherings, not only the priest or the preacher. But 1 Corinthians 14 would say, when people come together, they should admonish and edify each other, because in the gatherings, everything should contribute to the common good. But how is this supposed to work if only one person, namely the preacher, is allowed to speak in the congregation? If only one person speaks and the others listen and remain silent, then it would not be recognized that God dwells in the congregation with His Holy Spirit. So you see the Holy Spirit working only if everybody in the gathering is engaged. So the argument of the Swiss Anabaptists. And they conclude, a Christian has the responsibility to view a sermon he or she hears critically and reflect on the sermon. And if he or she has critique, then this has to be expressed. So Anabaptist gatherings in the 16th century were therefore designed so that all those present, men and women, took part in discussing about and interpreting the Bible, and were not afraid to speak and express their opinion. A community ordinance, which is also known among the early Hutterites, expresses this in a very similar way. The ordinance dates from 1529, and there it is said, at the community or at a church gathering, only one should speak and the rest listen. But then it does not say, and silent, but it says, and judge what is spoken, and not 2 or 3 standing at once. So this is get involved, be wakeful, and think about what you hear. Speak out, but not all at the same time. In order that everyone could participate in the interpretation of the Bible, many Anabaptists had their own New Testaments and took it along to the gatherings, although books were very expensive at that time. But they had the books along at the gatherings and sometimes read silently in it. That's what some sources say. Or another source, we get to know Paul Lenz. Paul Lenz was an Anabaptist from the area around Innsbruck, and he later moved to Moravia. But when Paul Lenz was still in the area around Innsbruck, he still went to the Catholic service. But when he came home, he would pick up the New Testament and read from it to his family. And he began to think about the sermon and to engage with the sermon that the Catholic priest had given. And it is said in the sources that he criticized it sharply. As the illiteracy rate was very high in the 16th century, and since books were very expensive, the Anabaptists assigned people to read loud from the Bible. Thus, the Anabaptists ensured that even those who could not read could take part in the discussion. The precondition, that was the precondition for living one's Christian life in maturity. Let's turn to community. Community. The early Hutterites felt the need to get together. The early Anabaptists felt the need to come together, and they wished to get together. They had a longing for it. It is remarkable that the meetings took place several days, as I had told you, and that many people attended these meetings despite the persecution. And even though attending an Anabaptist meeting meant to expect prison or even death. We still have this phenomenon until today. When you think of countries where Christians are persecuted, we see that churches grow where Christians are persecuted. Other signs of a close-knit community that can also already be seen in Tyrol is that the Anabaptists had a common purse. So there was one man called Säckelmeister who had the purse, and it is said in the sources they didn't have everything gemein, as the Hutterites did later words, but they had a common purse, and it said each person who came into the gatherings and came into the brotherhood had to pay for the others. However, there was not yet a community name. The Anabaptists called each other brother and sister. A name for the Hutterites themselves probably first appeared in 1559, when it is said in the sources that there is a Hutterite. So I think that's really the first time that the name of the Hutterites is mentioned in 1559, where it said there is a Hutterite. And a short view on nonviolence. Nonviolence. By their nonviolence, the Hutterites became publicly visible. We know from the sources that the Hutterites carried no weapons when they were on the road than a stick. So they just had a walking stick, walk, but no other weapons when they traveled. Non-violence for the early Anabaptists also meant not fighting back. If an Anabaptist was attacked, he or she should not defend him or herself. Interestingly, this seems to have changed, at least for a few persons in Tyrol at the same point. There are sources from the late 1530s that state that the Anabaptists would now carry a sidearm and a long knife. And now it becomes interesting, because the sources say with the changing in the attitude in arming, the authorities complained now that the Anabaptists were no longer as visible and easy to recognize as before. In the past, Anabaptists could be recognized by the fact that they did not wear anything that could be used as a weapon. Now they would carry sidearms and handguns, and they could no longer be recognized as Anabaptists. Obviously, we know from the Hutterites that in Moravia that they have had a very strict form of non-resistance and defenselessness. They did not fight back. But we have this short impression here from Tyrol that's very interesting. So let's now turn our attention to the time in Moravia. And we see here on the map the streams that went to Moravia in the 16th century. In the course of the 16th century, all the lines here show the mission work of the Anabaptists, and all the people coming to Moravia added to the number of the colonies. And as you can see on the next slide, the Hutterites became very organized and consolidated in Moravia, and you see here all the dots is a colony. You have Vienna down here at the Danube, and you have Brünn in the north, and then all the Hutterite colonies in between. So very many Hutterite colonies in the 16th century in Moravia, growing and growing. And this also meant that you all know that the episode or the epochs of the Hutterites in Moravia had the good time, the golden times. So the times of the Hutterites in Moravia were very good times, and there were minor problems. There were problems, but we hear about them. But there were no problems with the authorities. It was a good life with no persecution, and the Hutterites had a very good time there. There are various accounts of the times in Moravia in the Chronicle that go beyond a mere list of events that took place. Again, from the Chronicle, we here have again reflections of the chronicler that we can read. We have descriptions of how community life took place. And you might know the best well-known quotations about the life in Moravia. That's maybe this one here. Everyone where he was worked for the common good to supply the needs of all and to give help and support wherever it was needed. It was indeed a perfect body whose living, active members served one another. Think of the most ingenious work of a clock, where one piece helps another to make it go, so that it serves its purpose. Or think of the bees, those useful little insects working together in their hive, some making wax, some honey, some fetching water, until their noble work of making sweet honey is done. Not only for their own needs, but enough to share with all the others with men. That is how it was among the brothers. And it continues, so there has to be an order in all areas, for the matters of life can be properly maintained and furthered only where order reigns. Even more so in the house of God, whose master, builder, and establisher is the Lord himself. Where there is no order, there is disorder. There God does not dwell, and the house soon collapses. All in all, there was no one who walked idly, each doing what he was commanded to do and what he was able to do, even if he had been noble, rich, or poor before. So, very well-known pictures, hopefully for you, from the Hutterite Chronicle. They describe the Hutterite community as an ideal community. The Hutterite community as a clockwork or a beehive. Nobody went idle. Everyone worked together and served the common good. These quotations are repeatedly interpreted as a description of the Hutterite community. But, as aptly as these images describe a close, well-functioning, and well-organized community, they are also always somehow an idealization. A vision of the ideal community and the vision how the ideal community should look like. The quotations are a prime example of Breitbich's intention. The story should be a mirror, or the chronicle and the history should be a mirror for the Hutterites, as a reminder and for improvement. And ultimately, as we have seen, they are guided memory or a usable past that should have an impact on later generations, as in the Martyrs Mirror. Later generations are shown an ideal image of former times in this description of the church. Let's have a look at the development of the church community in Moravia. The Hutterites set up a confessional and economic project in Moravia that was unprecedented in the Anabaptist context. So it was really astonishing and not known in other Anabaptist branches what the Hutterites did in Moravia. They became very successful economically. They grew enormously. New colonies were constantly being founded. You saw the map. And in regard to their confessional and spiritual status, they developed a very structured community. Especially the constant growth in person, but also economically, made it necessary for the Hutterites to establish rules and regulations. Given the size and the economic power of the Hutterite community, rules and regulations were needed. And you all might know this engraving here. I always use it because it shows all the crafts and all the industry the Hutterites had in that time in Moravia. You saw the scissors and the krügel and the ceramics, so everything's portrayed here. So the growing of the Hutterite community in Moravia made it necessary that ordinances and regulations were issued. The main and most of the ordinances stem probably from the time after 1565 under the elders Peter Walcott, then Hans Krähl, Klaus Breidel, and Sebastian Dietrich. And you have here one example of one ordinance, and you see that the wine seal is the one who is in focus here. These ordinances regulated how each member of the congregation was to behave and which tasks the various ministries, offices, and the various economic branches had. There were regulations for very different areas. First, for the social and for the communal coexistence. For example, ordinances address the service of the steward or the householder, the offices the office that was responsible for providing the Hutterites with the necessities of life, or the Weizsäcker here. There were also regulations that said what food each group within the Hutterite church should eat. That's the so-called Kuchenordnung, kitchen ordinances. Besides ordinances for the social and communal coexistence, what do I do? Shall I do something else, or should I put that out here? I don't know. Why does it take? Okay. I'll put it back, maybe that helps. Okay, so maybe now you sleep when I put it here. Okay, well, let's just continue. So the second group of ordinances that address the various crafts. They specified how a product should be manufactured, how it should look, which materials should be used, or which of the trades should be involved in producing a specific craft. So that was very detailed what the ordinances told. For example, locksmiths, tailors, settlers, blacksmiths, wainwrights, etc. were involved in the manufacture of a carriage that the Hutterites produced. All trades that I mentioned were practiced on Hutterite communities. So in Moravia, the Hutterites give themselves structures. Ordinances record rules, and beside this, hierarchies emerged. For example, now each colony had a Vorsteher and a steward. This process was good because a community of the size of the Hutterites were in need of a structure. A community needs order, otherwise there will be disorder, as we read. But such a process is always also a danger, because structures and ordinances can make a congregation rigid and stiff. Ordinances and regulations can let life and vitality die. If a community is only held together by ordinances, then there is something wrong with the life of the community. If only external structures provide cohesion, this is not healthy, especially not in a Christian context. Ordinances should strengthen the inner conviction or accompany them, but they should never replace an inner conviction as to why you are together as a community. Well, the Hutterites in Moravia experienced exactly what I described. We can see and we can discover this when we look at the orders and the regulations in more detail. Because the ordinances not only prescribe what should be done and how Hutterites should live, they also record everything that did not work well within the community. Especially when something is repeated in various ordinances again and again for years, we can conclude that this grievance was permanent. And there was a lot that was repeated again and again. The ordinances are thus a corrective to the very idealistic view that we just read in the Chronicle. Sometimes the clockwork did not run smoothly at all. The swarm of bees did not fly around tireless, but some bees were rather lazy in the Hutterite community. And in the course of the 16th century, there were numerous grievances that had to be settled. It can be said that Hutterite life became more and more organized in the course of the 16th century, but at the same time, there were massive problems in the practice of communal life. For example, self-interest and undermining community of goods and communal life. This has often been a problem for the Hutterites throughout history. You probably know all that this word here, Gottes Wort wäre nicht so schwer, wenn der Eigennutz nicht wäre. So, self-interest. Now you're awake again, that's fine. Self-interest, the death of community of goods, It is reported that craftsmen were lining their own pockets, so they put the money in their own pocket and did not deliver the money to the householders. The good and lavish life that the Hutterites led did not necessarily have a positive effect on community life. The desire for luxury grew, and for owning my own property grew. The products that the Hutterites made in Moravia were often luxury products because the customers demanded luxury products and the Hutterites produced them. However, the desire to have such luxury products gradually grew among the Hutterites themselves. For example, precious ceramics, beautiful clothing. We learn from the ordinances that some Hutterites were very nobly dressed in the late 16th century. They wore best clothes and the most beautiful silk and white colors, as it is said. Thus, the ordinances demand in regular intervals simplicity, humble, and understated or simple clothing. And the Hutterites sometimes didn't care much about community in the 16th century. That's also something we can see from the ordinances. Some Hutterites just left the communities or the colonies without permission to go to the nearby town, to the markets, or to the inns. All this is not bad in itself. I mean, that can be, but it must always be seen on the background of communal living. It must not destroy communal living. So community life requires responsibility on the part of the individuals, and that's why responsibility is always connected to maturity. Yeah? To be a mature Christian, to be a mature Hutterite, what does that mean? What does it mean for my life within the community? Rules and regulations must support the maturity of people in the community. Rules and regulations should never be issued for the sake of the ordinance in itself or for the sake of the general order, but must be understandable for the individual. Yeah? And the question always has to be answered, why do we issue a rule? Where do we still have a rule? And maybe we can ask ourselves from now, looking back, why was a rule be issued? And it is best when rules are not just dictated, when a system of rules is not rigid, but part of a discussion process. Jesse Hofer described that in its volume Innovation and Tradition very nicely. It is also important, these rules, or rules in general, need to be checked again and again to see whether they are still helpful for community life, or whether they make it too rigid. Do rules still make sense for us today? Among the Hutterites in the late 16th century, luxury, self-interest, self-sufficiency, and the importance of families undermined often the idea of community of goods. And one last point, the ordinances also reveal another interesting development that was seen as a threat to the community. There was a hierarchy developing in the community. Not all were equal anymore. Not all were treated equally. No, some were more equal than the others. From the beginning, the elders enjoyed general special honors, and it is zweifache Ehren, it is called in the sources. Special honors. For example, they received better food and ate separately from the others. There was an elders' table, a table for the elders, or sometimes even the elders ate in a separate room. The Kugelordnung show that the elders received a richer and more sumptuous meal, so better meal, until the early 17th century. And it is often reported that the elders dressed more expensively, more rich, more nice. All of this is repeatedly criticized because in the eyes of some Hutterites, but also in the eyes of the outsiders, it undermines the idea of community. It was criticized from the outside, for example, quite early by Wilhelm Holbein, well-known Anabaptist from Switzerland in the early 16th century. He came from Württemberg and often visited Moravia and visited the Hutterites. And he wrote once that the elders in Austerlitz would live like nobles. They would enjoy meat, fish, and good wine, while the ordinary members of the congregation would have to be content with peas and cabbage, so have not so good food than the elders had. So, mature, communal, and peaceful, what does Hutterite history can teach us today? Let's look for a last example for maturity. A report again from the Chronicle, but from the Kleingeschichtbuch. The Kleingeschichtbuch, Johannes Waldner, draws the following conclusion at the end of the 18th century. And here it says, after Brother Hans Kleinsasser had died and Matthias Hofer had left the community, the order of worship they had introduced began little by little to lapse and disappear. I do not mean to commend this neglect, nor am I glad for it. The gatherings for prayer, and especially the reading at midday, help build up the young people's faith. As preciously described, each read in turn, and so each was involved. And it often led to a talk about the meaning of the passage of the Holy Scripture. At that time, each one took pains to be able to read out the Scripture fluently. And such a practice should still be used with good conscience today. Now, each young brother wants to have a good, well-bound Bible with big print. But many of them, always excepting the zealous, know little of what is inside. Paul taught in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. It would have been possible to drop what was unnecessary and exaggerated and to keep what was good, but each can judge the matter as he sees fit. Again, an outward system, or just the Bible as a nice book, was more important than the inner, but it fostered the discussion. Yeah, you see how interpreting the Bible was conducted here. So, if we think about times of transition, if we think what is Hutterite in a time of transition, and if we ask what are the challenges for the Hutterites today, I'd like to conclude with some words you, Kenny, wrote in one of our books that we published during the 5 or 6 years of Anabaptist commemoration. You wrote that life for the Hutterites, or the life in the 21st century, confronts the Hutterites with special challenges. The change from persecution to propriety, from hardship to comfort and convenience. What does living maturely mean for Hutterites today? Which is the tension between we are all individuals and we are living more and more according to that conviction. We are individuals also as Hutterites. And the desire and the Hutterite tradition of living in community. How to deal with this challenge that comes out of these sentences. So with this I conclude, and I hope I could take you a little bit into some, well, as I think, important aspects of Hutterite history, of mainly the 16th century, but also then in later times. And maybe you have some questions or remarks, what history or Hutterite history has to tell us today. Thank you.